Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our third in our webinar series on patient data licensing. My name is Kirsten Loita, and I'm a partner here at Osage University Partners, leading our university relations efforts. We have two guest panelists today, and I'll have each of them introduce themselves. We'll go to the next slide. Angie, could you lead off our introductions?
Hi, I'm Angie Kujak. I'm a senior director and head of the office, OSAP. It's our Office of Strategic Alliances and Partnering at the Broad Institute. And I oversee a team of about 12 attorneys and 3 paralegals. And we work to take inventions arising out of the Broad Institute, patent and license them to commercial entities.
Great, thank you. Steve.
I'm Steve Gardner. I'm a partner at the law firm Quarles. I'm located in our Madison, Wisconsin office. I'm a patent attorney. My background's in computer engineering, but I spend a significant amount of my practice helping with university licensing, almost exclusively on the licensor side. So I've dealt with a lot of the same issues and worked with Angie on a lot of these things in the past.
Yes, I used to be at the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, WARF, and UCLA, both of which I heavily relied on Steve's guidance still today at the Broad as well.
I think many people rely on Steve's guidance, probably even more after this particular webinar. So we'll go to the next slide. And as I mentioned, this is the third in our series of the webinars that we are producing that cover things such as what is the data, what can we do with that particular data, and then how are academic institutions licensing patient data. That's our webinar today. The previous two are available on OUP's YouTube channel, as well as our partner portal. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we do have 2 additional webinars scheduled for this particular series, one on data licensing case studies that we're planning for August, and another that's a Q&A session, just because we've had so many questions come up during this webinar series that we'll have in September. And we will be covering GDPR then as well, because we've had a lot of questions on that area as well. So, and we'd like to go out and ahead and thank 2 of our collaborators with this particular series, Ropes and Gray and Quarles, for working with us on this webinar series, as well as all of our academic partner presenters who worked with us on this series as well. We'll go to the next slide. You will find this presentation and recording of this webinar on OUP's partner portal, which is available to our partner institutions. We'll also have a recording available on our YouTube channel. The partner portal is an online portal for the tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner universities that's full of relevant tech transfer and startup content. Once you're in the portal, which you do need to register for, you'll find a downloadable presentation deck and a video link for this webinar on our webinars page, which is under the startup resources section. We do encourage questions throughout this webinar. We received a number of questions ahead of time. We've incorporated the answers to most of those questions throughout this webinar. But if questions come up during the webinar, please go ahead and use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit your questions. Please don't use the chat. That's actually harder for us to follow. So please use the Q&A tool when you're asking your questions to us. I'll be tracking those and asking them of our panelists. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, actually, and one thing I should have mentioned on the previous slide, we don't need to go back to it though, Steve, thanks, is that everyone who has registered for this webinar will receive the link to the webinar that is going to be posted on YouTube, as well as this particular deck. So you'll go ahead and have this deck. You don't need to copy everything down as we go through it today. So a little bit of information about CLE credit. Thanks to Ropes and Gray, we are able to offer CLE credit in certain states today. You can see which states those are on this particular slide. We will be sending documents and instructions on how to submit this to everyone who registered after the webinar. We are going to share the code verbally later during the webinar. One of our presenters will be doing that. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, a short intro on OUP for those of you who do not know us. We're a venture fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising the participation rights available through their licenses. As part of this partnership, the institutions share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups, such as this webinar. OUP is now on its 4th fund, and we've made investments in over 130 different companies in all areas of deep sciences. And many of those companies have had successful exits either through IPOs or mergers and acquisitions. And if we go to the next slide, this shows some of our portfolio companies and the breadth of areas that we invest in. We're always happy to talk more about our model, so feel free to reach out to us to do so. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Steve to get into the meat of our webinar.
Thanks, Kirsten. So the topic for today is how are academic institutions licensing patient data? So the first two in this series dealt a lot more with, privacy laws. What can you do with data? So Angie and I thought we'll sort of assume that there is some path forward through the privacy law arena. And we really want to talk about nuts and bolts of actually licensing patient data. So on the agenda for today, and this is guided somewhat by some of the questions we received in advance, we'll start by talking about IP policies and how those interact with data licensing, because I think a lot of IP policies are very patent focused, somewhat copyright focused, but not all of them deal a ton with data. And so we had a lot of questions on this, and we'll help navigate and give some thoughts on how other universities that we work with are navigating this. Then we're going to talk a little bit about capturing data's value and how you assess that, how you make a value proposition to a licensee. Then Angie and I thought it'd be worth talking about actual terms that ought to be in a data license. And the takeaway there hopefully is don't just use your patent license and swap the word data in place of patent. There's an awful lot of things that need to be different in a data license from a patent license. And then we'll conclude with a couple of hypotheticals where we walk through some of the things that we talked about. So starting with IP policies, like I mentioned, there's often not a lot in university IP policies that addresses data specifically. Data is not really an IP right on its own, and so it sometimes kind of gets left out of the mix in these policies. But a couple things to be aware of: IP policies sometimes have a lot of nuances to ownership of copyrightable works. Sometimes IP policies will carve out certain categories of works, like academic or teaching works that remain owned by the faculty member. Sometimes publications that a faculty member will write will remain owned by the faculty member or become owned by a journal, and data can sometimes get caught up in that. So I will just say, even if you have an IP policy that deals with copyright specifically, I wouldn't trust that as being good enough to confer rights to, that a tech transfer office could license. We've had some questions about work for hire. I would assume that doesn't apply. There's probably a number of circumstances where it might, but the actual work for hire statute in the Copyright Act is more limited than most people think. There's one category that says if somebody who is an employee, you can't be a contractor, created something in the course of their employment duties, that could be work for hire, but it's a lot more restrictive than you think. It's really, were you specifically directing that person, or you assigned that person a task, and the employer has the ability to assign them a different task. And this is, spelled out as part of their job duties. The case law on this isn't really compatible with the sort of notions of academic freedom and letting researchers do what they want to do. The Copyright Act also spells out a number of specific categories that could be work for hire, depending on how a contract is written, and none of those are data. So, long and short, I probably wouldn't rely on copyright law as conferring enough rights in data. So what's the solution to this? Most institutions that are thinking through this and grappling with this will just use a specific assignment document from the creators of data on a case-by-case basis to make sure that they have rights in the data that they can license. Sometimes this is done as just sort of something bolted onto a patent assignment. So a researcher will assign invention and all of the data and everything that relates to an invention disclosure form. So you can capture biological material rights and data rights and know-how, and they bundle that all together. When there's not an actual patent involved, I probably wouldn't recommend having a regular practice of having faculty assign data. I just do it on a case-by-case basis. When the possibility of a data license arises, it's worth just papering that up The assignment document for data rights looks very similar to a patent assignment, so you can talk to your counsel about putting that together for you. But overall, I think the takeaway is I wouldn't necessarily rely on an IP policy being good enough. And on a case-by-case basis, you probably want to take actual assignment. Angie, any thoughts to add on this? Any practices you guys have?
Yeah, it's really helpful to get those specific assignments also for tracking, which I know you'll get to, is how do you share consideration with the authors, or the contributors to that data. I have found that process also enlightening. It pulls out other contributors because you can kind of embed into your process. Was there anyone else that contributed to that data set? And often you can kind of cross-check with a publication. Are there people in that publication that aren't, haven't assigned? And it ultimately will help you in your license agreement, because you can say, to the extent assigned to us by, you can go as specific as, to the extent assigned by these particular individuals. Those are the rights we're granting to you. So a lot of advantages to getting that specific assignment. I will say, I think there's a lot of backdropping policies and laws that can apply to that can result in an entity owning the data, but it's just good practice if you're going to grant an affirmative license in a license agreement to take that little extra step. It'll help you in the longer run, or in the long run.
We've had a few questions come in already, actually, if we want to go. Excuse me, I'm sneezing. Apologies. So the first question is from someone with the University of California system. It says the University of California would likely need to retain the full right to use and share the data broadly. So how exclusive can we really get with a licensee? Angie, do you want to address that, since you used to work in the UC system?
Yeah, sure. So, most institutions, I won't say all, have a pretty firm policy that they won't grant exclusive rights around data. I mean, it's a very tricky thing to do. How are you ensuring that same data won't get out again by the researcher or incorporated into another data set that is then licensed? So for a lot of just technical reasons, it can be difficult. And I have found that most companies can get over that issue pretty readily, because it's just, it's typically one aspect of their overall product. The data, they're not looking to use that as an enforcement strategy where they're going to sue someone for, and we can get into what would you sue someone under, and then how would you prove damages and all of that. So in short, I think most institutions really stick with a non-exclusive license, maybe with a period of exclusivity where you feel comfortable you could do that. You could keep that data under wraps, but most universities, including the Broad Institute, take a pretty firm position that it will only offer non-exclusive.
I agree. And I think in rare circumstance, you'll see, licenses the grant clause get a little complicated, where the licensee just insists on there being some promise of exclusivity somehow. So you might call it co-exclusive just to have the word there, but then the university carves out that, okay, we're still going to use this for our own purposes, and we're going to let others use it for research purposes, because that's what, federal grant might require. And so you kind of have this like a very diluted version of some sort of promise of exclusivity. It just sort of amounts to, I won't grant a written license to another commercial entity for commercial purposes, So you can give the appearance of some sort of exclusivity, but I've really never seen, like Angie said, people truly exclusively licensed data.
Okay, great. Next question. For patient data, isn't it the case that the university or med center already owns the data, consent forms, hospital forms, et cetera? This person's not understanding why there is a need for assignments. Angie, you want to take that first?
Sure. So I think, Steve also represents for-profit entities who don't, and other academic institutions that don't have a hospital system. I think a lot of hospital systems do have, you have to check, and I think Steve said he wouldn't rely necessarily on the IP policy. It's not that you wouldn't rely, you take that one step with more nuance, like you should read it to see what it says. Like your IP policy might be silent on data, in which case you may want to really think about getting specific assignment. Not that you have to, but you have to do your homework if you're going to grant licenses, just like you do with the patent license. We make sure we have assignment if there's other co-owners. But yes, a lot of hospital systems already have this worked out. It's a and you could just speak with your, it depends on your particular hospital system. I would hate to say like, here's how hospital systems manage that, because
that it really varies. It depends on the circumstances for when the patient record, when and how it was created. But I will say, when we are doing due diligence in the rare circumstance on a licensee side or an acquirer, they always want a rep that says you own the data and all IP rights therein. So just in case there's some layer of copyright or trade secret or know-how, some states will recognize something less than trade secret. The ownership of hospital records under the laws, I think the questioner is thinking of, probably doesn't include specific mention of IP rights. So for that reason, I'd still recommend it, just to save yourself some headache down the road when due diligence comes around.
All right, thank you both.
Revenue distribution, Angie sort of teased this idea. This is one where I think even IP policies that account for ownership of data and research results and so forth really don't think too deeply into this question. And unfortunately, people start thinking of this a little bit too late and find themselves in a situation where you're going to make someone upset. But just to kind of set the background, the Bayh-Dole Act, at least at a federal level, the Bayh-Dole Act doesn't require revenue sharing to anyone but an inventor. Most grant guidance documents, NIH, NSF, likewise, they'll mention ownership of data and they'll mention ownership of confidential information, software, things like that, but really aren't going to require you to share revenue with anyone other than, quote unquote, inventor, which is a patent specific word. So in circumstances where institutions want to share revenue with people who are non-inventors, maybe someone who developed a biological material or a sample or generated a data set, you have to document who is going to be entitled to revenue, how you determine they're going to be entitled to revenue, why that is, how much revenue. And the reason is there's actually risk of liability to a university here. So an IP policy probably will say 30% of revenue from a license for this invention will go to the inventors. So you as an institution, you're sort of contractually bound to give them 30%. If you start chipping away at that percentage by giving revenue to people who you deem contributors of data, you're actually taking money away from people that you already promised it to. And there have been circumstances, some that make it to the courtroom, but most that are just sort of dealt with in a way that makes no one happy. That the contributors do complain and bring claims to either to administration or by a court action to try and get their entitlement to revenue. So one possible solution, we do have at least a couple clients that do this, is on an agreement by agreement basis. All of the inventors, anyone who's going to get revenue, agree on their share, so that you just have it in writing. Now, you can't always get them to agree or get their attention, but that's at least what they try to do. Angie, any thoughts on how you approach that?
Yeah, I think considering how you incorporate the consideration or the value into the license agreement can be important too. Considering at least separating out the consideration paid for the data, particularly if you're bundling it with other IP assets. There's some advantages to bundling that, but one of the downsides is that you can get it over in an argument with a non-inventor contributor over their respective value to the overall license deal. So one thing to consider is to separate that out, keep it distinct, and then to the extent you can prospectively get an agreement, as Steve said, before money is on the table. And yeah, it's a complicated question because it depends on where that data is generated. I think we're still working through, as institutions across the nation, how do we feel about revenue sharing with the creators? What does it mean when it's health records? Grappling with those questions. Does that go back to the department? Maybe it's a department share rather than anything going back to specific creators of that data. So lots of unanswered questions at this time. I think it will settle out and some trends will, float to the top.
I have a couple of things. So one person actually wrote in the Q&A box that their IP policy includes not only inventors but also creators. So for them, it's already baked in. to that. So that's seems to me one potential solution. But another question that has come up is, whether, if you do end up doing this royalty sharing and as Steve, as you mentioned, you're perhaps doing something on a case-by-case basis and having everyone agree to it, should it follow the same lines of how patent intellectual property is divvied up, or is it something that's a little bit different?
Different, and actually that's the next slide on the screen.
Okay.
There's just a couple clients of Quarles that we've helped think about this or actually implement this idea of how are we going to really define this. And so you might have a category who's people who are not inventors, but they're contributors, and this could be similar to the questionnaires policy. I think they're usually entitled to a lower percentage of overall consideration. There might be 40% total is going to go to a bin that is inventors plus contributors, and some portion of that goes to contributors and some portion goes to inventors. And depending on the license, you might have one bucket or the other or both. But these contributors, I think you need to be a bit more specific about who they are. So you don't want to just, be giving revenue to the medical records tech who entered data into an EMR. It's got to be someone who contributed something creative or formative. These are words we've seen in these policies. That was really someone who compiled the data or analyzed the data in a way that recognized its value to the licensee. So, there are institutions that are going to collect a lot of data from patients, but before that data actually gets licensed, someone has to compile it and process it and decide what goes in or not. And so this is how I've seen at least a couple institutions who have gone down this road define it. Now, changing policy can be tough, institution to institution. Sometimes you have to involve the faculty senate and the board, but this is one way people have tried to do it. And so when we talk about having this sort of like case-by-case basis and everyone agrees, short of actually having an IP policy, you could have a set of terms and conditions that spell all this out, that you ask everyone to agree on, rather than kind of negotiate everything from the get-go. So it's not quite a policy, but maybe a standard approach.
I know my gut has been like, this question comes up, how far out do you reach? How many contributors? I try to raise the question, would you list them on a publication, or did you list them on the applicable publication? I think that's very telling. If they've added something of particular value to the overall research, it's a nice tool to have in your pocket to bring up, like, if with these types of questions, because it can be a lot of gray space.
Yep. And I haven't, I guess, seen a lot of at least Quarles clients publish these sorts of default terms and conditions, because this is an area that's changing so much and every instance is different. So it's usually, some people have it as a policy, but usually when it's short of a policy and it's just sort of incorporated terms into a case-by-case agreement, they're not publishing those percentages. Where this becomes complicated, we sort of touched on this already, is when you have a hybrid license that's going to license data and patents. And this is happening increasingly, like in AI technologies, where there's software and an algorithm and data. Even really thorough IP policies aren't always providing clear answers, as to how you do the math here. If you have 5 people who are data generators and 1 person who's an inventor, it's not really going to be a pro rata split in most circumstances. So not only do you have to decide, we are going to designate some amount of money to data generators, but what if someone's a data generator and an inventor? What is their percentage? I don't want to make this sound like an excessively complicated thing and dissuade people from wanting to license data. I honestly don't think universities are going to have a choice. You're going to continue to be asked to license data. But this is something to think about now, rather than, when you're in the midst of drafting a license, or once the first revenue comes in and you're trying to figure out how to distribute it. Decide this now, and make a position within your office. You can make sure that everyone is always aware that they're going to share revenue. In some circumstances, we've had clients recognize a data creator after a license has already been granted, and they've decided to take a small share out of their own piece of the pie rather than dilute inventors. So that has been one possible solution that people have taken, after the fact.
And here's where separating the consideration is key. If you can predict it's going to be a contentious issue, so that you have contributors allocated to the data consideration versus, and you can even do that in a royalty. Say you agree to 3%, you can agree a 0.5% of that is allocated toward the license granted in relation to the data. And I will say, since 2010, I've been in the university licensing arena since then. I have seen an incredible uptick. I rarely do today, in the last 5 years, rarely have done a license without some sort of non-patented asset, whether it's software, data, copyright, some other asset, materials, because I think more and more development is happening at the universities before it takes that leap to another entity for further development. And so that data, even negative data, I've had quite a few licenses, because it's good to know, just troubleshooting internally. How can we not repeat the same experiments that failed? So that's where it's like, when we get to the valuation, it's really critical to think about what the value is of that data. It may not always support, it may actually save you time and money, and therefore is a value from a different perspective.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about, assuming that you've got your policies set up correctly, and you know how you would allocate revenue internally to data, you're ready to start thinking about how you will go about licensing. So Angie and I thought the first question that you ought to ask is, do you actually need to license data? So Angie, do you want to take this one?
Sure. And I always start from the minimal, like, how can I avoid it? Because there's so many hurdles with privacy, interpretation of the consent. It goes through a complicated, often in a university, approval process. And time is everything with data. With a patent, it's usually filed, patent application is filed. You can negotiate for 2 years because they're probably not selling for a couple of years, and you can kind of go through that lengthy process. In the case of a data license, its value is often, as soon as it can, the earlier that they can get access to it, the longer it's less and not published, less accessible to others. Using it in development early on, you typically exhaust often data at the front end of development. So timing is everything. So trying to find the easiest path for it to go out. And I have found, and I'm trying to guess, maybe 80% of the time, I've switched something that started out as speaking in terms of a license agreement and shifted it to something else, whether it's fee for service, whether it's sponsored research, where you can aggregate it to a degree before it gets transferred out, then you avoid a lot of those privacy issues. And you give the licensee the same end result that they want. Even in the regulatory perspective, can you do enable a cross-reference from the FDA rather than sending the data out the door? Does that give them enough? So it's starting with, like, I typically start with no, and then find out what small piece of rights that or access that they need and how I can most easily leverage it. And it's least expensive for them too, is they appreciate that. Can you set up a sandbox where they come in, train their algorithm, never really get access to the data, and then take their algorithm back out so that it doesn't leave your university's security boundaries? So I do a lot of effort on this front end before going down the path of a license. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think it's a lot of times the knee-jerk reaction is for our clients to start by thinking, can we de-identify this? How much does that cost? What's the PR of this data being out in the public? And a lot of hand-wringing about letting the data out the door when you might not need to do that. So it's really important to make this a conversation with the licensee and say, what is it that you want? Do you just want to run some sort of regression on this data and come up with an algorithm? The RPIs can do that, and you don't need the data. So other times, there's just data where we think and we agree with the licensee where it's just so sensitive. It ticks so many different boxes. It's biometric. It's it's patient health information, that to try to get that out to a licensee is just too big of a hurdle. And so we don't even go down that road because the licensee agrees right away once they understand what's actually in the data and what applies to it.
Can I ask a quick question? It's a little bit tangential to this, but one person asked, are there any types of data that are considered not licensable? Like there just is not a way to license it?
Sort of.
Right.
So state biometric laws will say the person who collects biometric data, some of them say this, you simply cannot profit from it, period. So you could look at Illinois, it's called BIPA, biometric law, and some other states have different versions of that, but it includes things like someone's DNA, facial recognition scans, things like that. You simply just can't profit from it. So that's about the only total roadblock I'm aware of. And that depends on, the individual's residency.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other than like a consent form, I guess I should throw that in, that doesn't enable it, but that's part of prior webinars that.
Yeah. And even then you could try to de-identify or reconsent, but
So I get this question a lot. A lot of colleagues and I call each other, like trying to assess, what do you think, how do you assess value of data? And I try to put into a pictorial, like in a picture of what is in my brain when I'm looking at all the different pieces and parts of assessing this. And I will say, I'll start with the fulcrum, the bottom triangle of where that seesaw is placed, where that pivot point. It's really important. I start out with how important is it to get this data out in view of our mission? Is it diversifying an AI algorithm that will reach a broader and be more reliant or be more accurate based on a wider population because I'm enabling something great? Or is it a bunch of student data that I'm just we're doing it for profit? So I always start there. How important is it to the mission? And the more important it is, the more steps and hurdles I'm willing to go through and figure out to make it happen. And then I throw out a bunch of things like, can I license it again? How unique is it? It's a lot like materials. When someone comes to a mouse model, if you're the only one with a cell line, you kind of have a little bit more negotiation power in a situation like that. But then you balance that, of course, against your mission and getting it out and making sure that you have widespread research happening on that cell line. But you start there. How unique is what you have? How expensive would it be and time consuming would it be for the company to recreate that? If it's a bunch of clinical trial data from a phase 1, you can imagine what, you can do the calculus. What did it cost us to do that trial? And we found positive data. So there's that on top of it. Even if they repeated it, they may have ended up, I think Steve, you had on one of your slides, like they may result in negative data. So like there's an advantage to licensing what is a positive result and already completed and de-risked. Volume, how much is it? Are we talking about just like something we can fit on a thumb drive or even an appendix, or is it a hard drive that we're picking up or using a big platform? Like the Broad Institute often uses Terra platform. It's this large platform that we can transfer data around. What are we talking about? And is it going to be co-licensed with a patent where we're further enabling the ability for our technology to be developed more quickly and ultimately getting to market sooner to treat patients? It's all of these different floating variables that really depend on a case-by-case basis. It's not one of those scenarios where you can call and say, well, we typically use 2 to 3%, on patents. We have like sort of buckets that we have over time learned what's reasonable in a particular tech space for patents. We don't quite have that yet for data because there's just too many moving variables. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we at Quarles, we're not evaluators, we're lawyers. So we tend to say no whenever clients ask us to tell them what their technology is worth. But I think even in this area, there's less out there than almost anything else in terms of what the right value is for data. So I would just say, like Angie said, balance how this is going to help accelerate royalties for other IP or get your PI's technology out there. Is it going to serve a public mission? I probably wouldn't get as hung up on, should it be 2% or 1.5%? No one is at this point going to look at your agreement and think, oh, geez, they really let a lot of value out the door. There just aren't a lot of standards here, and data is just too variable for that, for there to be really good comps.
And then how do you capture that? So once you've determined, like, you have the relative value of it. Now, how do you structure your license deal, the provisions, and how you get that consideration? How do you do that in a way that you can actually get that consideration back? I kind of divide it into two groups. Is it a black box model, meaning I won't know whether they actually use the data or not? If that's the case, I'm looking for consideration types like equity or liquidity event payment where they reach a certain success level, something that's not necessarily tied to a specific product where I can police and track. And if it's more trackable, then I think of, more of a royalty. If that's, if the company doesn't have a lot of cash up front or doesn't want to give equity, maybe I can defer some of that consideration in the form of a royalty later on, but then tracking becomes a challenge, like trying to pursue that and paper it in a way that you'll actually be able to collect on that royalty. And then with the picture of the circle going outward, it's just how soon do you get that consideration too? A lot of universities I'm hearing are saying, well, no, we will never take anything but an upfront fee because it's just too difficult to track. Others, with the pressure of like combined with a patent license, and it will enable the mission of advancing that technology. Well, maybe they'll take more risk and go for a royalty tail where they will get paid for so many years after the patent expires. And that will be attributed to the data rights. So there's many moving parts, but it's a really case by case. And I don't know about you, Steve, I hear all the time, like, why should we pay after, it's published? They'll insert in the license agreement, but if it becomes published, then we owe you nothing. And there's a lot of value pre-publication that the company extracts and gains in terms of time and money that it later, if it is a company, a startup, which we often are working with, you end up back end, putting it in the future in the form of a royalty. And so it's ensuring that you're also thinking about those moving parts. I've even done it so that if it stays non-published for so many months, because we at the Broad and all the other institutions I've worked at, we can't constrain researchers from publishing. So maybe, base the royalty percentage on, have it step down if it publishes earlier, if the value of that data is not as great after the point of publication, they weren't able to extract as much value. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add to this.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is licensees and their counsel and advisors tend to talk out of both sides of their mouth. If you emphasize that the real value is today, time and cost savings, accelerated development, then they don't want to pay a royalty on the back end because they say, well, once everyone else is in the market, all of a sudden now I have a higher overhead because I'm paying you. When the value is all right now, I should pay you right now. And I think sometimes when you start asking for upfront payments, then they say, well, wait a minute, don't you want me to get to market? So there's always going to be a retort. And I would, again, just say there's not enough uniformity in how data agreements are structured that you should feel any compunction about, I've decided the value of this data is time and cost savings. And so I'm going to tie how I structure value to time and cost savings and don't be, put off by the response you'll get from counsel. They're going to have a response, licensees counsel, no matter what you do. So think about what the value is, tie your consideration that you're asking for to that value. And, like Angie said, it can take all sorts of different forms.
A big chunk of that value too might even be in your favor, where you don't have to charge as much because maybe you view that data as preserving patent term life, in the sense of increasing that length of the royalty term, because we too have a vested interest in ensuring and rapid, in terms of mission, getting our technologies to the market to impact lives. At the Broad, we're very mission focused. And so that's become an increasingly bigger driver and calculus when I look at data. Is this furthering our technology to reach patients further? Well, I keep that in mind when I'm pricing things out, because that's what my driver is. So it's really going back to what is your mission and viewing it through that lens, because it's not going to be the same across every university.
Right. For example, if you say accelerated development, you'll get to market sooner. So there's a bigger window where you'll be making money. Then we're talking about windows of life. Maybe an extended patent royalty makes sense in that circumstance. You'll have profited more because you had more years of exclusivity. So anyway, I think again, I'll just repeat myself. There's no wrong answer.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. I mean, it's many people on this call likely already understand a lot of these points, and we've touched on them throughout the webinar. But a big piece of, and we do this often with patent licenses as well, making sure you limit it to institutions' ownership interest in the data rather than the whole data set. Here's where I've even been specific to individuals, as assigned, and I'll attach even the assignments in certain cases just to evidence what it is, in fact, that was assigned. Non-exclusive, I think we touched on this. Sublicensing is a big one to consider and be mindful of. I think Steve's point earlier that you can't pick up a patent license and just search and replace with data and assume that would be good enough. A lot of consents and permissions are made specific to a company when it goes through an internal review process. The committee that you received approval from may have said, yes, it's okay that you transfer it to startup A, your licensee, but maybe they won't feel the same if it ends up in company B because it's transferred or assigned. So you have to watch out for your standard sublicensing provisions, assignment clauses, transferability, making sure you expressly state non-transferable, non-sublicensable, separating out your grants between your patent grant and your data grant. So there are different, you have to review the whole agreement from a different lens.
Mm-hmm. That's why I think at the term sheet stage, it's really important to talk about these things and what's going to apply to data, because, when people are thinking they're negotiating a patent license and you get halfway through and all of a sudden you're bootstrapping data license provisions into your agreement, licensees and their counsel are going to react really negatively because they're thinking we've got this technology to use for any reason we want, and we've got backup indications, and that increases the value of our company. And they're right. But I think when you start saying, but actually all this data you can only use for these purposes, it's important to talk about that up front. And that's why I probably wouldn't go down the road of a patent license, because it's not going to have those terms in it. Some of the restrictions.
Yeah, and the make, use, sell, offer for sale, import under the patent statutes, you have to think about those two a little differently. I tend to be very specific. It's again going like, what are the minimal rights that I can let out the door, and explain what I don't want data misused and someone coming to me and saying, how did they use this data and do something wonky with it. That's my seated fear. So it's being very specific. You can only use it for the purposes of creating a patent product that is, or for this particular regulatory filing, your one time. I've even had inquiries, what if they use that data in patent prosecution? You just have to be very mindful of all of the things that they could extract from that data, that you're very specific, coextensive in scope of the license grant and their obligation to pay too. The tenet of always starting with, does your license grant, is it coextensive in scope? Can they exploit it in any way that doesn't trigger a royalty? And I've even put in the grant before, solely in a manner that triggers a royalty under section 4.1. if you want to be very firm about it. So there's just data licenses, be specific. And then of course, things that you normally wouldn't call out, and Steve, this is largely information I pulled from you over the years, but the need, what does silence mean? What do you need to expressly call out? When in doubt, expressly call it out. And you have to worry about when silence, what does that mean? Does that mean they have an implied right to reverse engineer? Just say that they can't. And re-identifying a patient, make sure you expressly state that, trying any attempts, because we just don't know where technology may move to, and it may currently exist to do that with certain data formats. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and data isn't IP. So in a patent license, you don't have to contractually bind them not to operate outside the field of use, because if they did, it'd be patent infringement, and everyone understands that. But with data, there isn't really an independent right to sue someone for data, taking data. Most states, not all, but most states won't allow you to bring a cause of action for like theft of data or misuse of data unless the data itself rises to the level of a trade secret. So that every state has a Uniform Trade Secret Act, and a lot of states have said that preempts there being any other sort of like tort cause of action for misuse of data. So if you've given someone data and you're silent about, you say you could use it for this purpose, and you don't say you can't use it for any other purpose, you're in a murky area whether you could bring any kind of cause of action or actually stop them from using it outside of that specific permissive field of use.
Oh, before we move on, just one more. Destruction upon termination, including products made through the use of. You really want to watch out for cut and run, where someone takes a license, extracts the value, and terminates. Read your agreement to see if that, what happens if that would occur. Considering a lot of provisions surviving termination, obligations that carry with it, tying it to the company's products and assets, and making sure they can't assign away their assets separate from their obligation to pay under a data license. So you have to get kind of creative, but if you have a very valuable data license where they could stop using the data, think about what that license agreement, how you're going to ensure you can enforce it at a later date when the company matures and may split, and who knows what tomorrow might bring.
We have a lot of questions. I'm just going to let you guys know that. I think maybe after this slide, before we get to the hypotheticals, we'll go through some of them.
Yeah.
And you'll have access to these slides, so I'll just leave them up. Won't go through them step by step, each one, but just know that, again, you can't pick up that patent license and assume that the disclaimers and the warranties and the limitation of liability can be leveraged in the same way. You need to look at them with fresh eyes, think about what you need for protection as an institution.
Okay.
All right.
Why don't I read the CLE code, Kirsten, before
we please. Yes.
move on? So if you are getting CLE credit, the code is 8751. And that's, again, 8751. So you'll need that when you submit for CLE.
Great. Thanks. And again, we'll be sending out the forms to everyone shortly, or if you need the form, just contact Katie, who you registered with. All right, so some questions before we get to the hypotheticals, which actually may answer some of these questions, but we'll see. So one of the questions is, what about potentially licensing a data analysis instead of transferring the actual data? Have you done that before? Angie, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, this is going to the beginning of the slides of one of those strategies. How can I avoid at all costs licensing out the raw data? Can we somehow aggregate it and they will be able to extract the same information that they need? So yes, definitely. Okay, typically great. In the context of a sponsored research agreement though, and that's a value then back to the university as well, and they get paid for their time. So there can be kind of a win-win. All right, and the next one I will start with you, Steve, for an answer. This organization has a lot of patient data, so they're approached by companies looking to validate their algorithms, the company's algorithms. They are not looking for a collaboration or partnership. Is there a way to frame such an agreement without the appearance of selling patient data?
Yes. So I think, first of all, this is going to get a little into HIPAA, which is again, not Angie or my area, but we do have clients that do that. You have to be really careful on if you're going to actually send data out, that it really ought to be de-identified. And you have to make sure it's not biometric data. There's a lot of hurdles there. In that circumstance, I think if they want to validate something, and it can be done within the institution without having to send data outside, that's possible. There's just, even when you de-identify data, so once it's de-identified, HIPAA doesn't apply, but how you de-identify can create different risks. And, HIPAA isn't the only thing that you have to worry about. So, we have healthcare organizations that just have massive amounts of like radiology images, and companies always want those to, train and refine their algorithm. And that's a really tough one, and they're navigating it. And we have privacy counsel here at Quarles that are helping them navigate that. But when it wasn't collected with a consent that is going to allow for this kind of thing, it gets increasingly more difficult.
I think that mission question can be really helpful too. I know that's where we often started at UCLA and think, how does this, and we definitely do this at the Broad, is how does this further our mission? And, even in the case of an algorithm, as we've all been hearing about algorithms that are trained on incomplete data sets, do we have a mission to ensure that that doesn't happen, that these algorithms are robustly trained on transparent data sets that enable others to understand how they were trained? That's at the Broad, we are quite data heavy. We have a lot of data, not necessarily from healthcare systems, but these are the types of lenses that we view. We always start with mission. How can this further that and protect and patients and improve the advancement of science and healthcare? And in that kind of scenario, if you can start and answer that question fairly easily, and record that somewhere, like I know some institutions have a check sheet for approvals, and it goes through various hands. Off the top of the form is, what's the mission? How does it address University X's mission? Consider that too. That can be a nice backing as to why we did a particular deal. That may not be apparent 10 years later.
Right. And we had a comment from one of the attendees that HIPAA is the floor and state laws must be considered, such as CMIA. And then another person had written in about Washington State's, I think, kind of newer law, the My Health, My Data Act, and asking about what impact the act that has on the rights to use the data. I think that's really probably a question more for kind of the local council, who knows probably those particular acts and therefore what those actually prohibit or enable the institutions to do. But any comments on kind of those state acts as well, Stephen?
Yeah, our privacy council is like all they'll talk about is Washington State's law. And just to give a little bit of color to it, most state laws govern like if you're a resident or if the data exists in that state. There's like some geographic component to it. But this Washington State law deals with data that is stored there. And of course, Amazon and Microsoft have massive cloud servers in Washington State. So, to the extent that you have data that's stored in the cloud, there's a really good chance that this Washington State law will apply. It's going to create headaches for the tech companies in Washington State, but also could bring in all sorts of questions for lots of different people. So I would say there's not really good guidance on that right now. And there's just some jaws dropping at this. And I wonder whether it will get changed before it really starts to take effect.
And I would be cautious about, it's always good to get your colleagues at different institutions, their opinions on things, but the way that they're set up in view of, like I saw one of the attendees to talk about covered entities, and HIPAA only applies to covered entities. It's really important to have the correct lens on when you're reviewing for your particular entity in view of all these regulatory, like GDPR as well as another headache, or BAAs, business associate agreements, all of these questions. While you can kind of get a general sense from your colleagues at other institutions, I would caution and go to outside counsel, because once it's out, it's not like a patent license, which you can quickly take back. Once you've, the damage is out, it's hard, it's done.
So just to let all of our attendees know, we are going to go longer than the 1 hour, just because we're not going to be able to get through all these questions and the hypotheticals. So if you have to leave on the hour, we are recording this. We will send the recording after. And we know that some people usually have to leave at the hour. Some of you have already, fortunately, cleared your calendars to go a little bit longer than that, because you know that we usually go over the hours on these. But just to let you know, that will be happening. I'll also be putting our survey link in the chat shortly. But I do want to answer a few more questions before we get to the hypothetical. Angie, would a sponsored research agreement capture the value of the data if a license agreement might not be possible or the best option? Have you ever tried using a sponsored research agreement instead?
I have, and with a fee built in, upon delivery of the data, you can even put a fee on that. It'll be $50,000 or whatever you might think is reasonable. You have to kind of do some language around that, depending upon how your university works and what, how that fee would be shared and everything. But yes, you can even build in a fee. Yeah. Go ahead.
And that's these questions are really validating because we worked really hard to come up with hypotheticals that would tease out a bunch of these issues, and you're all asking them already anyway. So it's good. The one thing I will say about sponsored research is I think in that context, you're a lot less likely to get a royalty, because then you're just in this mindset of the company is paying for this data to be created or generated for them, or an analysis to be generated for them, and aren't always willing to have the downstream royalty. Now you can say, there's sort of bonanza clauses or milestones of certain style, but I think you're less likely to get a royalty if you have a lot that goes into a sponsored research agreement and actually funding the work.
All right, I'm going to ask 2 more questions. There are a few more that I'm going to ask at the end, but 2 more questions before we get to the hypotheticals. How is the new NIH policy requiring that data be made freely available affecting policy and practice on data licensing? And if you already answered this, I apologize, but I didn't recall hearing it. So Steve, maybe I can start with you on that.
I haven't seen it impact much at all. And I think the rule is essentially about as specific as you just said, Kirsten. It's really not requiring a specific manner of making it available. I think this is in their guidance document. But I haven't seen that really impact things. And quite frankly, there's lots of circumstances in the past where people have published already anyway, and you're still going through a value conversation with a licensee anyway. I mean, I think the fact that they're still asking for a license is telling. So I have not seen that impact much.
And I don't know if I heard the question correctly. I have seen it in one aspect where it implicated GDPR, and how could we solve for that and have the data deposited, and I may be misunderstanding the question, data deposited in a repository that's outside of the US, not what we typically go to here in the US, but I know we've had some headaches with Broad. We need to publish, GDPR is implicated. How can we effectuate or satisfy these obligations? And I think ultimately we looked at foreign data repositories similar to those that we have in the US that we routinely deposit in.
Great. Next question that this attendee is asking is, they're currently addressing an issue where a high impact journal consortium requires the institution and a PI to assign the clinical manuscript copyright to the journal as a work for hire. Have you come across this before, and how do you address this to maximize retention of these rights?
So I would say if they're asking for it to be assigned as a work for hire, they probably need better lawyers, because you really can't do that. So copyright in journal articles often is owned by the publisher, and that's never changed. But I would say copyright in an article is limited to just the way that you express, like the creativity and the way that you express the idea. It doesn't cover the idea itself. That's called the merger doctrine. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you have your data compiled in a certain way, that's obviously not going to be in the manuscript itself. They're not going to take ownership of that. And yeah, I've not heard of the work for hire thing, but that's not going to work for them.
Okay, great, thanks. And then last one before we get to the hypotheticals. Has the CCPA recognized patient rights in their data such that they would be recognized as an inventor or a contributor entitled to a percentage of the revenue? So this question is really about the patients and their rights in the data.
I haven't look at that yet, and I believe the CCPA, I think that's the California Consumer Protection Act.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. So
I think so.
Yep. That is something to navigate. I don't know, unfortunately.
Yeah. I don't know. I think you'd have to ask somebody who's specific privacy counsel. But at least, in my anecdotal experience, I haven't seen someone have like a specific cause of action where they're going to be entitled to revenue because you use their data.
Okay.
But with questions like this, it goes back to, I know we keep saying it, like, go back to consulting, or excuse me, sponsored research, fee for service analysis. What can you do to avoid it? Because something like that, if that question came up, most universities are going to say, I'm not going to spend the money on outside counsel, or I can't. How are you going to make it happen? Well, maybe internally.
All right, well, let's go ahead to your hypotheticals. I realize we do have a few more questions. We will get to those before the end as well.
Okay, we have two hypotheticals. One deals with patient data that's going to be used to support a regulatory filing. So the fact pattern is jumping across the screen. Essentially, two university faculty are researching a rare cardiovascular disease. They have a small investigator-initiated clinical trial using an off-label therapeutic provided by Pharmaco. Patients consented to use of their data, and you can, at your leisure, read what they said, but we sort of concocted that language to sound pretty good, but not super specific that you're going to profit off of this data and actually sell it or license it. So university files a patent application on a new use of this drug. They name only Professor Smith as an inventor. The licensing officer, Susan, contacts Pharmaco. Obviously, it's their drug, and they begin to discuss a license to the patent application. Partway through negotiations, the Pharmaco's counsel says, well, we need to add a license to all data from that clinical trial. So Susan approaches the university council to determine whether a license can be granted. So the question is a license possible? Yeah, it's probably possible. As you look at the wording here, it's got some good language. We see kind of squishy language like sponsor and its partners, probably good enough to cover a licensee. It specifically says sponsor can transfer the patient's data to its partners and licensees. So I'm sure your privacy counsel could help you navigate this. The question is, you've got a rare disease. It was a small trial. From a PR standpoint or an institutional standpoint, do you want that this small population who is likely to be able to figure out it was their data, do you want to be in that position of licensing that? So that goes to the second question. Should a license be granted? That's really a tough question. It's a rare disease. It could help people. On the other hand, this patient population may realize what you're doing. The third question, is a license necessary? And going back to, I think, the theme of this webinar, it may not be. Because there was a clinical trial, you might be able to transfer the clinical trial to Pharmaco and just let them deal with it and navigate all these questions themselves. You might be able to help them do some analysis of the data or give them a right of reference. There's all sorts of alternatives that don't get you in that question of looking at this consent language and what does this mean? What would someone think partners means? And really just doing this sort of like analysis of a word salad. You can save yourself some trouble and just decide, okay, there's an alternative. Angie, anything to add there?
Your hypothetical reminded me of like another provision to incorporate into a data license is to consider a clause that states, if at any time it is discovered that this data license breaks law, is contrary to any law, policy, or regulation, licensor has the right to immediately terminate the license and require that you cease all use of it. So, when you're venturing into this gray space, let's just say your mission says, yes, this is a rare disease. We want to enable this to happen. Maybe you quote and give only the rights from the consent in the scope of the license grant. And, so once you step into that murky area, putting up those protections to save and put together why, that's where you can, I've even baked it into whereas clauses explaining why the data is being licensed to further the mission of treating and finding a cure. We at the Broad, we deal with a lot of patient consortiums that are very interested in finding a cure. Often you will even find them on the other end. Sometimes they will be questioning how their data has been used. Sometimes they want their data to be used and they'll be 100% behind it and say, please, we do want to encourage research in this space. Maybe by licensing out our data in a controlled way, you'll attract additional research dollars to a space that otherwise wouldn't have that sort of attention. So we also consider those types of mission-oriented perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you could consider here as an alternative, maybe you do decide you want a license, but you structure the agreement to say, listen, you licensee are responsible for paying for reconsenting or de-identification, and you're going to take all of those risks for us. Maybe the IRB won't allow this, or maybe patients won't agree to reconsent, and we're really licensing you the result of this process, whatever it is. You might have a mishmash of some de-identified data, some data that can't be de-identified, some data that was reconsented, and you sort of put the risk on them to make that determination. I think in those circumstances, you definitely want to run that through, university administration, but I have seen that happen as well.
Your indemnification clauses, making sure, what if it triggers an audit from the FDA? You have to protect yourself and think ahead and go to that scary place of like, what could go wrong if something went wrong?
Yep.
Try to predict as many of those and expressly address them in the agreement so that there's no question that they're required to pay if the FDA comes in and audits your records, and there's time spent making those copies, pulling those records, compiling it for the FDA.
So let's assume that you and your privacy counsel figure out an acceptable way to either license or some alternative to a license. Then Pharmaco says, well, we don't want to pay anything for this data. We're just going to pay you the patent royalty. We should be able to just use this data for whatever purpose we want. So what can Susan tell Pharmaco regarding the value of the data? And that touches on some of the things Angie mentioned earlier. This data was done, it got a good result. The IRB approved it. We found a rare disease population. There's a lot of value here. I think you can see that Pharmaco's attorneys are going to say, well, listen, we own this drug. We gave it to you for purposes of this study. No one else can make use of this data anyway. Why are you trying to extract value from us? Angie, what are your thoughts on those? I'm sure you get that answer frequently.
I do, and it's like, broken record. I go back to the mission. If there's something else that I can get in exchange for that, maybe there's agreed to good faith efforts in discussing with us the prices placed on those drugs at a future date, even as minimal as that, just thinking creatively alternatives to, because we're not always as institutions driven toward making a financial return. Is there some other form of consideration that we could get in that case? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's even further research in that space from the company to continue and at least recoup the expense of the research that led to that data.
Yeah. And I think another thing you can mention is, they say, well, we own this asset. You own it now, and there is a sunset on your patent rights, Pharmaco, for composition of matter of this drug. So there is value in us telling you, you can have at least some continuing exclusivity. You've already got the supply chain put together to be able to market this drug. So, there's some value in saying now you've got patent rights and the data to get you to market on a new use of that. If Dr. Smith and Howard decide to publish, does that change the analysis on value? To me, no, I don't think it does, especially if what they need is full PHI, for regulatory purposes. That's certainly not going to get published. So I think, in my experience, it's not often, if ever, that a publication has enough of the data that it sort of extinguishes any remaining value in that data in the patient data context. Angie, any thought there?
Yeah, I often test it by saying, okay, let's take it out of the agreement then. We just don't need it. And they're quick to say, well, I mean, maybe there is some, what they're really interested in is the back and forth, the failures. I think that's one of the under-leveraged aspects of research is, what can companies learn from what already has failed? And are we doing a good job in sharing that information? I think companies are quick to look at patients and want to do a retrospective review of someone else's study to see what patients failed and maybe why, to increase their success. I think there's a great value there. So even unpublished details where they can see something, was there something about this particular patient's health record that made it less of a ideal candidate for the drug? Incredible value there. May not incorporate it into the final work product, but it definitely teaches a way or leads to new insights. Very rarely is everything published truly in a journal article.
Yep. And there's even an IND here. They had a clinical study that started. What provision should Susan include in the license in regard to use of the data? To me, the big one that pops out is affirmative restrictions. You started with a patent license, and it was only partway through that you added on data. You need to have all of these restrictions about what you can and cannot do with the data. What happens if the license terminates? What happens, who can you transfer data to? There's no set of sort of statutory or common law rules like there would be for a patent regarding what someone can or can't do with data. So to me, that's the big one. And then all of those liability clauses on one of Angie's slides as well. Angie, anything you would think? I know you already mentioned a few things.
Yeah, no, I'm good on this one.
Okay. So in this fact pattern, we also had, if you remember, only Dr. Smith was named on the patent as an inventor. So Susan realizes partway through, this is not going to benefit Dr. Howard, was really a key contributor to generating this data. So should Susan, or can Susan, do anything to ensure Dr. Howard is considered in revenue distribution? If we assume the IP policy for this university doesn't say anything about someone with a data license, you're in a tricky position if you're Susan, because there's already money on the table, and Dr. Smith might not like the idea of, someone else coming on board and diluting his share. So I think what you shouldn't do is just make a choice that you're going to compensate Dr. Howard unless it's already in a policy. So I think this discussion has to be had with both Dr. Smith and Dr. Howard, and determine if there's anyone else hanging out in the wings. I mean, this is going to get licensed to a company that already has this drug on the market. So, these inventors and creators are going to be more motivated, since there's actual money here. If Susan didn't realize this until after the license is already executed, revenue has started to come in. At that point, I don't think you can take money away from Dr. Smith. You'd have to probably go to administration and talk about whether you could give Dr. Howard something out of the university's share. Anything to add, Angie, here?
I know a lot of universities are rethinking their policies and considering a lab share, and giving something there that comes back and rewards those within the lab to have that discretionary funding. It's something that's top of mind for a lot of institutions I know right now, in view of data licenses.
Well, why don't we quickly go through this? I know we're already 15 minutes over, but I think we can get through this in a couple minutes. There's a few other questions, unless you want to. Yes.
Question, Steve. So someone asked about the CLE code again. Are we allowed to repeat it, or?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Would you mind repeating it again?
8751.
Great. Thank you.
I see a question that came in is experience with paid up data licenses. I mean, you could certainly do that sort of thing, especially, when there's a companion patent in that Pharmaco example where they've already got a bunch of their own IP. I think you'd be hard pressed to try and tie a royalty to data in that circumstance. I definitely have seen paid up data licenses. How about you, Angie?
But yes, I think a lot of institutions prefer that because it's so difficult to control. And every institution looks at data differently. They'll often base that on how much did it cost us to create it. Can we relicense it, do the division, and price it out that way, and just say, hey, this is what we're just recouping costs here.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go through this one quickly. This is more of an AI focused one. So we have a medical school. They compiled a data set in the course of patient treatment that correlates a bunch of things that would be in an EMR to the likelihood that patient specific interventions might alleviate mental health and drug abuse. So from a mission standpoint, this is really, something important. So a big healthcare organization, think like an insurance company or an HMO, wants the data so they can create a tool that helps family members, as well as a tool that's going, they're going to partner with companies to sort of generate localized care plans. What is available in your area, get really specific, almost sort of like a precision thing. So they want all of this data. You can look at this and think, okay, it doesn't really matter what the person's name was. Maybe it matters what their diagnosis was. To some extent, geography matters because you want localized care. So geography can be one of the sensitive areas of data. Genetic information can be sensitive. So you really want this to happen, but you're looking at probably more than just HIPAA here. Medical school faculty, of course, are very strongly in favor of this. So the tech transfer office says, okay, how can you make this work? There's not even a patent involved. So can the raw data just be given to the healthcare organization? Probably not. Whether or not they're a nonprofit, maybe it's a foundation, one of these like patient organizations like Angie mentioned, that doesn't really matter. And especially they're planning on having partnerships with for-profit companies to develop tools. So no, you're not going to give the raw data. But what about de-identification? There's two ways you could de-identify patient data under HIPAA, the safe harbor rule versus statistical de-identification. But you have to ask yourself, in this circumstance, will the results still be useful to the licensee? They want genetic information and they want geography and diagnosis, maybe age. There's other things that they're going to want. So there'll still be sensitive information there. So in this circumstance, I would be hard pressed to say de-identification is the right path forward. So the tech transfer office is going to assess some options. Number one, you could have that sort of license agreement, like I mentioned, where you're going to license de-identified data or limited data and require the licensee to pay for it. And they get whatever the result is that gets approved by the IRB or whatever patients are willing to reconsent to. There have been some clients that we found, maybe more clinics and hospital associations than universities, but they'll use business associate agreements or data use agreements to transfer out data like this. And that to me is rarely the right choice. A business associate agreement is really when someone's providing services to you that you're using in order to provide healthcare. So in this instance, your licensee is not really providing services to the medical school regarding that patient's care. That business associate agreement would be more like, an outside lab or, insurer or somebody like that who really needs this information. Data use agreement is often used with limited data sets, but in this circumstance, that's again probably not right because it's very restrictive. In order to provide some limited PHI to a licensee or the other party under data use agreement, they have to agree to a certain number of enumerated categories of restrictions, including you're not going to give this to anyone else. So they're not going to be partnering with companies to use this data. So that one doesn't really fit. Then looking at this, okay, what about a consulting agreement? That was one that we mentioned, but it has a lot of pros and cons in this circumstance. It takes the medical school out of the interaction with the licensee entirely, which is good in the sense of, reduce risk of liability for the medical school, but then you're also trusting your faculty member to navigate this like kind of thorny area and you're putting risk on them. So there are pros and cons to that. The one that seems to fit pretty well here again is the sponsored research or a fee for service. Can the training of this AI be done within the medical school itself? And then you're licensing software, as a result of the SRA. Angie, have you had experience with that sort of structure?
Yes, I have. And it's the most de-risked, sponsored research, fee for service. Yeah.
And I think sometimes you can have people who, are outside of the university, maybe, being hired on a consulting basis or vice versa to sort of get people around, confidentiality and allowing this sort of work to be done. So, there's not necessarily right or wrong answer. Obviously, this fact pattern is complex and it's going to depend. But to me, this is kind of the first question that should have been asked is, what could we do that would still work?
I think there'll be a real uptick. Today, ChatGPT, I think is in front of Congress, the CEO, to talk about AI and responsible training of algorithms. I think universities are going to be looked to as a trusted source for this type of data. So the sooner tech transfer offices start to think about these issues and work through them, the better, because I do think that it's only going to see more of this.
Mm-hmm. Value proposition, I'll just kind of touch on quickly. We mentioned a lot of this. You might ask for cost and reimbursement for de-identification. Your royalties you might be able to tie to use of the AI itself, not necessarily the data. Again, I mentioned this before, I think it's unlikely you're going to get royalties if you go down the sponsored research or fee for service route. I will also mention that consulting agreements don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive of sponsored research. There can be instances where most of the work involving the data is done within the university confines. The AI gets licensed out, but then, on an ongoing basis, there can be some consulting to help support that. So we should be at our last slide. Takeaways. Angie, do you want to go through this?
Yeah. Positive note, though, data licensing can be done, and we should consider doing it because there's a lot of good reasons why we should, as universities, contribute to our missions by ensuring that the results of our research that's going on and the data that's generated is leveraged and not repeated, so that scientific advances in healthcare can be done more quickly. Again, negative data can be just as valuable as positive data. And as tech transfer offices ourselves, like, how does that complement our portfolios and our efforts? And how do we think about that from a value perspective? I think it's just an inevitable route of where we're going, where patents play just a partial role of the overall tech transfer opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, like we mentioned, an important thing, if you haven't heard us say this enough, is start by assessing whether a license is the right approach. I will say, we didn't mention this before, but in one circumstance, we had a client that had an informed consent. It wasn't patient data, but it was biometric data. And the consent said that they were allowed to publish it. But of course, it's biometric, so you can't profit from it. So the university wound up licensing a patent and then just publishing the data as an open data set. And it's sort of serving mission. It's accelerating this technology. It'll be helpful to people. But right, I mean, needing to license, you don't need to license that. And in fact, it'd be too hard to do it.
Sometimes I ask myself on this question, in that gray space that you have to start stepping into, what happens if I don't make the data available too? Is there equal harm if I don't try to enable this? So, and if that answer is easy is that if it's quick, it's like, yeah, there is no harm, then I'm more conservative. But if it's, and I have found myself in the scenario of, wow, it's just as bad if I don't make this data available than if I do and take on some risk.
Mm-hmm. And then we mentioned, don't develop license terms now that are specific to, private data, patient data. It's very difficult to start bootstrapping that into a patent license on an ad hoc basis, because you won't think of everything. You sort of have this mindset partway through negotiation that what's the minimum we can get away with here to get into this license and just get it done. So it's worth doing that now. I think a lot of universities have exclusive patent license templates, and a lot of those have just sort of like throw in of technical information or other technology. And it's sort of put in there as a hope that there might be something else you could pin a royalty on someday. But as data becomes more valuable and the likelihood there actually is data that is going to fall in that category, I think you probably need another template that has all of these sort of restrictions and the types of clauses Angie was talking about, so that can be the first thing you share with a licensee, so that you're on the same playing field as far as what rights can be granted. And finally, being pragmatic about financials. I think we discussed this a lot. There's a value proposition of your data, and just try and tie, your consideration to that value proposition. I don't think you need to worry too much about where you land. There's no right or wrong answer.
Great, thanks. Let's in our last 5 minutes here, get to some more of the questions, but a couple of comments first from our audience. Do you want to actually move to the next slide, just so people do have actually the next slide after that? It shows the contact information for our speakers in case you would like to get in touch with them. Hopefully we got that right. But one comment was that one university mentioned that their informed consent document clarifies that the subject will not be entitled to any income that may be realized with their own data. So I don't know if that's a common practice that you're seeing or not with regards to informed consent documents. Steve, do you want to just address that quickly?
Yeah, and actually in preparation for this, I sort of polled a couple Quarles clients to see if the tech transfer offices had started trying to put together wording for sort of commercialization minded informed consent language. And There's one maybe that has tried it, but I think the uptake of those is very low. So I think it's probably important for tech transfer offices when you interact with faculty to start talking to them about it, because they're going to generate the first draft of the consent, and it's going to be focused on their research. So some of these other things, making clear that the university will profit and not the patients, that's probably something that the tech transfer office could have a role in broadcasting on campus.
Get
But
to
it
know who
hasn't
your
been done a lot
IRB.
yet.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Get to know where your IRB office is and speak to them, because things that seem very obvious to people who license every day, what you would want that consent form, less important necessarily to the IRB office when they're trying to approve a consent form to be used. And faculty are often picking up what they previously used or someone else, a colleague, handed to them. If you can do some education and say, hey, if you just include this one phrase, it'd be really helpful because we struggle with the word in development, so I'll stop there, but get to know your IRB office.
Right. Next question, and we only have 3 minutes because I know each of us actually have different things in a couple of minutes. Are you getting a royalty because you've enabled a product, or how do you justify royalties if data sets are used in validation or some other way? Angie?
Yes, it's typically enabled product type made through the use of, developed. But again, I'll go back to negative data is helpful too. And so it's something I'm constantly rethinking. How can I best address this issue and capture value? But I will say, I've been to 3 different institutions, each of which would view consideration a little different, and the importance of getting value. Currently at the Broad, it's very much mission oriented. Not that other institutions were previously at were not, but it just tends to be a bigger driver. Do we necessarily need a return? Is it enough that they might be developing a technology in this often rare disease space?
Next question was, are data license templates included in the resources section that's available on the OUP portal? Not yet, but we actually been working with some institutions on having some different data licensing resources available, such as template clauses. So hopefully stay tuned on that. Next question, how do we assert data licenses in an SRA when the sponsor is paying for the research, at least in part? Is a NERF for example, would a NERF for non-commercial use be appropriate? Steve?
Yeah, so that if you're sort of granting the NERF right away under the license, I would be a little concerned that it's too closely tied to I'm profiting from the data. Whereas if you can kind of say there'll be a license, maybe we negotiate a license afterward, something like that takes it a step farther away. But I will say in circumstances where there's going to be a license and more often than not, the sponsor asks for that, you're going to have limits on what you can get. The value is probably mostly going to be the sponsored research and maybe some milestones.
Where I've been more successful is where there's a pre-existing asset that they want to further leverage in that sponsored research. So you can kind of point to, we had this pre-existing investment that was.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Angie. Thank you so much, Steve, for being with us here today and providing all this terrific information. Just a reminder to everyone, we are having a Q&A webinar in September, where if we didn't get to all of the questions that you had today, or you think of other questions, many of our speakers will be coming back to that particular webinar. We're still figuring out what a date for that will be. So please join us then, and you can ask your additional questions then as well. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Angie and Steve, for all your expertise that you brought with us today.